Welcome to the Art Economies project, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Art Economies. This is the good-looking part of the CRC. We get to play with and work with artists right across Australia for the next 6 or 7 years. Just really start with a little bit of background about Aboriginal art and Torres Strait Islander art. There isn't a single art. There is as many forms of art and artists practising as there are cultural groups and language groups across Australia, from the Torres Strait down to southwest Western Australia, from Derby through to outback New South Wales. So when our project engages with artists and deals with some of the questions we have to answer, there isn't a single Aboriginal art, there isn't a unified version of this. There's an enormous subtlety and variation across the country. And just a snapshot of the sorts of styles of art that are out there. Some of these are probably familiar to you. They span the whole range of sort of languages and cultural groups. Again, to give you some sense of the scale, this is not our map. This is sort of taken from one of the Commonwealth funding agencies that supports a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art communities across Australia. They fund about 100 or so art programs, art centres most of you would be familiar with, but also sort of women's centres and cultural groups that are taking on some of these sort of art enterprise activities right across Australia. There's a real cluster in Central Australia and Northern Australia, but they do span right across, which obviously presents some challenges. And I guess it's in this environment that the Art Economies project was written up. While there is some quite detailed research in certain locations and around certain artists or certain practices, there is very little that presents a national picture. I guess the most recent example of that is in 2007. There was a Commonwealth Senate inquiry that was triggered by a range of things, partly the unethical and commercial transactions that happen in this industry, but also it was looking at sort of some future-proofing questions. And the first question they asked was, how big is this business? And even after nearly 40 years, there is an enormous variation in the answers, everything from sort of $100 million to $500 or $600 or more million a year. So there's very little information that really presents a national picture to understand how big this business is, how many artists, what that means for artists and communities in remote areas. And that's, I guess, the primary brief that we have, is that wide horizon to really be able to scan and work with artists and groups and communities right across Australia in taking on some of these questions, this real information vacuum that exists. In that information vacuum pop up all sorts of things. There's ridiculous articles that appear in the media talking about how the practice community art centres are somehow causing oversupply and collapse in the industry, and it's just everywhere you look there's a real lack of information. A little summary of the sorts of I guess the background where the Art Economies project sits within the CRC overall. Like everything else in the CRC, there's a real emphasis on end user. The first part of the project is weighted towards the research. The second part is weighted towards rolling out very practical, very useful, whether it's training, whether it's information, whether it's resources, whether it's advocacy, in all sorts of different ways, some of which we've yet to kind of articulate and understand. But none of us who are working on it now, and the board, I think, would reinforce that we're not really interested in doing things that aren't useful in the end. Improving livelihoods for artists in whatever capacity they're working is really the primary driver for us in the project. There's a range of subsidiary benefits. There's a bit of a generational shift happening out bush. A lot of the bush-born artists who were at the forefront of the last 20 or 30 years of practice, who have the name and have the profile and have driven a lot of the fine end of the market, the high-profile stuff, are getting old and passing away. There's an enormous variety of new media being practiced out bush, and nobody's quite sure, like everybody's doing it, nobody's quite sure how that might fit with the business models that currently exist, for example. New market opportunities, whether that's through changing the way the merchandising and manufactured goods that are out there, trying to potentially change the import laws so that people can't import backpacker-made boomerangs from Bali and those sorts of things. So it's a range of economic outcomes that will potentially, that we'd like to identify for people, but also clearly looking at ways to strengthen the ways that art enterprise works and that information for artists about their choices they make, because artists are clearly making a range of strategic choices about how they run their practice as individuals or as groups. Some research outputs. The main one we have, or the first large one, is the size and structure of the industry. How big is this? How does it work? The main methodology we were given was a value chain analysis. We've kind of expanded that language a little bit to talk about value chain networks. Value chain stuff has been a little bit of a challenge because it tends to be a bit reductive and it's a bit restricting sometimes when there's an enormous number of interdependencies in this business. And I'll show you a map in a moment that really shows how interdependent the different parts of this business are, and particularly how many of those sort of relationships are based on kind of intangibles, moral, ethical decisions, cultural drivers, and so on. That said, the solution to that also lies within the value chain stuff. If we need to provide outcomes and information based around value chains, we need to go back a step and unpack some of those anthropological and sociological questions around how art is made, why are people buying, and so on, so the different drivers in the business. So the value chain, we're working with the different layers of the business. So the art centres is a formal end, and it's, I guess, the ways that industry, or that part of the industry, is linked is fairly well understood. It's been around for nearly 40 years, that model. There's an increasing amount of art produced outside of art centres, and you'll see some in Alice Springs, people painting independently in a range of ways. Commercial galleries are a key one, the secondary market. Licensed and unlicensed product, the stuff that appears all sorts of places. Government, public galleries, the consumer, I guess the pull side of the industry. Why are people buying? How is the market made? How is value created in this industry? In the last couple of slides, just to show you, this is, I guess, our first version of the value network that's at play. So the series of factors and circumstances that allow artists to create the sort of work they are, passes through a series of agents, and then there's the buyers, the pull side of the industry, but they're linked in all sorts of complicated ways. This and the following slide is how we're thinking about arranging our research. This allows us to organise some questions and say, okay, we need an economic brain to understand the dollars being transacted here, but we also need some cultural, anthropological, sociological understanding of why people are painting and the drivers in their community, and talking to people like Cherie about what some of those mobility or livelihood choices are that people are making. So there's lots of ways we'll be talking to other projects under the CRC, because so much of it comes into the choices that people make. And as artists are the centre of all of this, this is just a different map we've been playing with about the sorts of relationships that artists need to understand or are part of in their practice. I think that's it. Thank you.